My name is Claire Bennett, and I'm 27 years old. 3 nights ago, my father stood in the middle of my sister's wedding rehearsal dinner, raised a glass of champagne, and proudly announced that he and my mother had spent over $80,000 to give their golden child the wedding she deserved. Everyone applauded. My sister Madison cried happy tears. My mom squeezed her hand. And then my grandfather's lawyer quietly stood up from the back table holding a sealed envelope with my name written across the front. The room changed after that. But before I tell you what happened, hit like and subscribe if you love emotional family revenge stories like this one. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. I read as many comments as I can, especially late at night when I can't sleep. Now let me take you back to the first time I realized my family already knew which daughter mattered more. I was 9 years old. Madison was 7. Grandpa Walter had taken us both fishing at Lake Briar, the same lake where he'd spent almost every summer since the 70s. He wore the same faded green jacket every year, even in warm weather. Said the pockets were lucky. Madison hated fishing. She complained about bugs. About the smell. About the dirt on her shoes. I loved it. I loved the silence of the water early in the morning. I loved the old wooden dock that creaked under your feet. I loved the way Grandpa explained everything slowly, like it mattered. That afternoon, Madison got bored and wandered back to the cabin to watch TV. Grandpa looked at me while we sat there alone beside the water and said something I didn't understand until years later. Some people only love things when they're shiny, he said quietly. Other people love them enough to take care of them. At 9 years old, I thought he was talking about fishing poles. He wasn't. Back home, things always tilted toward Madison in ways that were small enough to deny but painful enough to remember. When she made varsity cheerleading, my parents rented out a restaurant room. When I got a full academic scholarship offer from a state university, my dad nodded and said, "That's nice, Claire." Madison got new cars. I got lectures about responsibility. She got forgiven for everything. I got told to stop being dramatic. And somehow, over the years, I became the daughter who was expected to understand. Madison wanted. I accommodated. That was the system. I should have realized how bad it had gotten the Christmas my mother sold Grandma Evelyn's antique necklace to help pay for Madison's influencer trip to Tulum. Grandpa Walter didn't speak to my parents for almost 3 months after that. At the time, I thought he was angry about the necklace. Now I know it was bigger than that. 2 years later, Grandpa got sick. Not suddenly. Quietly. The kind of illness families pretend isn't serious until someone starts giving away old photographs. I visited him almost every evening after work. Madison visited twice. Once for a selfie she posted with the caption, "Love you forever Grandpa Red Heart #. The second time was because my mother forced her to go. One night, maybe 3 weeks before he died, Grandpa asked me to help him organize papers in the cabin office. The room smelled like cedarwood and old books. Rain tapped softly against the windows. He handed me a small brass key. "Someday," he said, "you'll understand why I kept certain things private." I remember laughing nervously. "Grandpa, you're being mysterious again." But he just smiled. Tired. Quiet. Almost sad. After he passed away, my parents moved fast. Too fast. Within days, Madison's wedding suddenly became more extravagant. My mom started talking about luxury venues. My father kept having hushed phone calls in the garage. And then one night, I overheard something that made my stomach drop. Dad said once the estate clears, Madison's future is set. Estate. Not memories. Not grief. Money. I stood in the hallway holding a glass of water while my mother laughed softly and said Dad would have wanted Madison to have the perfect wedding. I remember thinking, would he? Or did you just decide that for him? 3 months later, invitations went out for Madison's wedding at the Grand Marquette Hotel downtown. Crystal chandeliers. Imported flowers. Ice sculptures. My parents paid for everything. $80,000. Maybe more. Meanwhile, my apartment ceiling leaked every time it rained. The week before the wedding, I drove to Grandpa's cabin alone. The place felt smaller without him in it. Still smelled like pine needles and coffee. His fishing jacket still hung beside the door. And that's when I remembered the brass key. I found the lockbox exactly where he said it would be. Behind the loose panel beneath the staircase. Inside was a stack of documents. Property records. Bank paperwork. And one sealed envelope labeled, "For Claire." Only after the rehearsal dinner. My hands actually shook. At the bottom was a business card. Daniel Mercer, attorney at law. The next morning, I called him. He asked me one question. "Has the wedding rehearsal happened yet?" I said no. And he replied, "Then do not tell your family anything yet." That was the moment everything started making sense. The rehearsal dinner was held at this massive rooftop restaurant overlooking the city skyline. Madison wore white even though it wasn't the wedding yet. My mother cried every 15 minutes. My father kept making speeches about family legacy. And I sat there knowing something they didn't. Halfway through dinner, Dad stood up smiling with his champagne glass raised. "I just want to say how proud I am," he announced loudly. "Madison has always had a special light about her. And thanks to the blessing Grandpa Walter left this family, we've been able to give her the wedding of her dreams." People clapped. Madison beamed. Then my father looked directly at me. "And Claire, thank you for understanding that sometimes family sacrifices have to be made." The entire table looked at me waiting for some gracious response. I smiled. Small. Calm. Because right then, Daniel Mercer stood up from the back table holding Grandpa's envelope. "I believe," he said carefully, "that this belongs to Claire." The room went silent. My mother actually blinked like she stopped breathing for a second. Dad frowned immediately. "What is this?" Daniel ignored him and handed me the envelope. Inside was Grandpa's letter. And attached to it, the deed to Lake Briar Cabin. Along with trust documents. My grandfather hadn't just protected the cabin. He protected everything connected to it. The land. The savings account. His investments. Nearly $1.8 million. All placed into a trust under my name 18 months earlier. My father's face lost color so fast it honestly scared me. Madison whispered, "What?" Daniel spoke calmly. Walter Bennett specifically instructed that these documents be revealed publicly if estate funds were used irresponsibly before probate concluded. My mother stood up so quickly her chair scraped across the floor. "That's ridiculous." But Daniel kept going. "The $80,000 used for this wedding came directly from estate accounts your father legally restricted from discretionary spending." Nobody moved. Nobody even touched their drinks. And then Daniel said the sentence I think my father will hear in nightmares for the rest of his life. "Which means there will likely be a formal investigation." Madison started crying instantly. Not soft crying. Panicked crying. Dad kept repeating, "There has to be some mistake." But there wasn't. Grandpa knew exactly who they were. That was the horrible part. He knew. The letter was only 1 page long. But one line destroyed me. "Claire, some people inherit money. I wanted you to inherit safety." I had to look down because I felt tears burning behind my eyes. Not because of the money. Because someone finally chose me first. For once. The dinner ended 30 minutes later. Guests practically fled the restaurant. My mother cornered me near the elevators whispering furiously, "You embarrassed this family." I stared at her for a long moment before answering. "No, Mom. Grandpa just stopped you from embarrassing him." She looked like I slapped her. Dad didn't speak to me at all. He just sat at the table staring at the city through the windows like he'd aged 10 years in one night. The investigation started 2 weeks later. Turns out Grandpa's attorney had been monitoring the estate spending the entire time. My parents eventually settled privately to avoid criminal charges. The wedding still happened. Smaller. Much smaller. Madison blamed me for months. But deep down, I think she finally realized something that night. She wasn't the center of every story anymore. 6 months later, I moved into the cabin permanently. I repaired the old dock. Repainted the porch. Kept Grandpa's fishing jacket hanging exactly where it always was. Sometimes early in the morning, the lake gets completely still. No wind. No sound. Just water reflecting the trees like glass. And every time I sit there with my coffee, I think about something Grandpa once told me when I was little. People show you who they are when money gets involved. He was right. But he also showed me something else. Love isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like preparation. Sometimes it looks like protection. Sometimes it looks like an old man quietly building a future for the granddaughter he knew would someday need it. And honestly, that meant more to me than the money ever could. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments, have you ever been treated differently inside your own family? And if you stayed until the end, subscribe for more emotional revenge stories like this one. I have another story coming soon that honestly might be even crazier than this one.